All right, folks. Hello and welcome back to another fun-filled episode of the Hammercast. I am your host, Alex, the Hebrew Hammer Salkin, and joining me today is Mark Limbaga, all the way from the Philippines. That's right, the complete opposite side of the world, and we are going to be talking about all things coaching, kettlebell training, calisthenics, original strength, what it's like to introduce kettlebell training to a part of the world that has very likely never heard of any of that, and all sorts of other stuff. So this is going to be a good conversation, lots of fun. And one thing I want to make sure that I make mention of as well while we're talking about introducing things to people, if you have not yet been introduced to my 9-minute kettlebell and bodyweight challenge, that's a big mistake. But you can rectify that mistake by going to 9minutechallenge.com, which is the number 9minutechallenge.com, and getting your own copy. It is based around movements that are designed to be done with whatever workouts you're doing now. So it wouldn't really matter if you were doing yoga or if you were lifting kettlebells or anything like that, because it's focused around the gait pattern, which is your body's walking pattern, arguably the most natural movement pattern there is. And what's very cool is that some of the moves that are found within have a tendency to really craft a lot of strength in people or help them to open up the storehouses of strength that they currently can't access. Like I've had people who've done some of the moves in there, which, things like crawling, loaded carries, things like that. Last year or two, there was a gal from Sweden, Lena. She's been on the podcast before. Who got she could see her abs for the first time in like ages after 14 days worth of crawling. And she credits the crawling for helping her with that. A guy named Barak from Israel who took his pull-ups from 6 reps to 8 reps just by doing daily loaded carries. And again, not by doing some crazy pull-up protocol. So stuff like this can go a really long way, like I said, in helping you build strength, but also unlock the strength that you already have. So 9minutechallenge.com, get your own free copy, start making some gains for the new year and beyond. So without further ado, Mark, thank you very much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me, and it's great that we finally got to chat after so long.
Yes, it's been at least 10 years, I think, since we've had contact, but it's usually via carrier pigeon or singing telegram, periodically social media, but
And smoke signal sometimes.
smoke signals. Yep, can't forget about the smoke signals. Very difficult to get smoke signals all the way to the Philippines. I will tell you that. Like given that it's in a completely different hemisphere and part of the world, that makes a big difference. But yes, through the magic of technology, primarily Zoom, we are now talking in real time. And one of the things we were talking about a little bit before we began was your role in being a kettlebell coach for as long as you've been in the Philippines. And one thing I'm very curious about in particular is like your origin story, because obviously, kettlebells weren't like, a big thing even in the West until, I don't know, I want to say probably around the 2010 is when you could randomly bump into somebody who knew what a kettlebell was. And that's because of all the marketing efforts in the US to make it over the course of like 10 years in order to, make it a part of the zeitgeist. So it must have been even harder in the Philippines. So I do want to talk about that. But before we get to that, I want to ask about like your origin story. So like, were you always into physical training? Were you into sports or athletics or what? Like, how did you get, like, show us the path that ended up taking you to kettlebells.
Okay, so to make it brief, I was always a skinny kid, but I jokingly say that I had the hybrid of being both the nerd and the jock.
Mm-hmm.
So it depends on who would want to take over that day. So as I recall, I was fond of playing sports, but then of course, when you're not physically gifted, that's where the challenges come in. And then fast forward, when I hit my 20s, I decided to start going to a gym, typical route, the pick up the fitness magazines, copy their programs. And then I believe it was late 2009 when I first discovered that Crazy Cannonball was a handle called a kettlebell. And then I was toying with it because there were some guys who were using it locally. And then I decided to take the deep dive. thanks to technology, wonders of the internet and YouTube, and then I discovered Pavel, and then I discovered this crazy book crazy program called Kettlebell Muscle. And since I was already using complexes, barbell, dumbbell, and body weight complexes prior to that, I decided to try it since it was something familiar to me. And I was so blown away that I put on 7 pounds of muscle in 6 weeks. And even though it was a holiday season and I was basically just being like Cookie Monster who drank 3 Red Bulls and was hungry, but I did not get fat. So I said, there's something with this tool. And then I dove deeper. Fast forward to 2012, I decided to get certified, took my level 1 certification in Australia. And as they say, the rest is history.
Wow. And when did you say this was in Australia?
That was 2012. I could still remember the dates. It was 23rd to 25th, if I recall,
Wow. Yeah. So
of November.
It's been over 10 years.
Yeah, it has.
And was this through, probably, I guess back then that would have still been RKC, right?
Yes, if I recall, that was the last Pavel era RKC that we still had the RKC by Pavel that was signed by Pavel. I think 2013 there were 2 or 3 more certs, but they weren't signed by Pavel anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. And so once you got certified, did you immediately start working as a trainer? Did you start, I mean, I'm guessing probably you were spreading the word of kettlebell training amongst, your friends and family members. But then when it came to doing it full time, how did that come about?
Oh, so I was already a trainer prior to getting certified with kettlebells.
Hmm.
So I was slowly introducing it to my students, and I was also telling my friends and my training partners from the combat sports field about it. So everyone was excited to see what I had to come, what I was going to bring back as soon as I got back from Australia. And then I took the. They also decided to see what was in store, and they were all excited that, hey, this tool is actually really good. And I remember I actually had a student who I put on kettlebell training. So I openly told him, "You're gonna be my guinea pig because we have a teaching segment at the cert. So I need your help to help me prepare for that." I said, even though I'm teaching, I want to make sure I'm doing this right. And through the process, I believe he lost like 30 or 40 pounds.
Wow, that's pretty good. That's very good.
Yeah, and I was blown away myself.
Well, it's amazing. I think a lot of us don't really think about it because we've been in the kettlebell world for so long. But at the beginning, like some of these, what seemed to be really lofty promises for kettlebells, they really weren't that far off from the truth. It was like, I saw like a quantum leap in my own strength. A lot of people saw a massive improvement in their leanness. And it makes sense if you think about it, because there's a lot of things that there are a lot of things that you do with a kettlebell that just promote those things naturally. So even if, particularly at the beginning, now obviously, like, as time goes on, you do have to consider, what you're eating. You also have to consider other factors. But at least initially, it's like such a shock to the system that most people aren't even expecting it to be possible. But but moving weights very quickly, using full body movements as opposed to just isolation movements as we see in bodybuilding. And nothing wrong with bodybuilding, but that's just kind of the approach most people took. It felt like a whole different world. And I find it interesting that you were already a trainer before, because I got certified in 2010 and I was only 24. It's weird to think about that now. Like at the time, I was just like, okay, whatever. Now I look back and I'm like, man, I can't believe how young I was. And most of the other people there that I noticed, there were a lot of them who were just enthusiasts, but there were also a lot of trainers. And so what I found was especially impressive is that, as a lot of times with trainers, it's very easy to get stuck into a certain mode. Like, well, this is just the way that I do things. This is just what I found works. And then after a while, you don't necessarily want to keep adding stuff. I feel like I'm willing to add stuff and I'm always willing to learn more, but and there are plenty of other trainers who are like that as well, but not most of them. I think most of them, at least the ones who have stuck around for a while, kind of get stuck in their ways. So I always found that to be very impressive, that there were so many who were so convinced that this was going to be such a boon to their business as well as to their clients' improvements with their body composition and strength and what have you, that they're like, I need to learn how to do this. Was it hard to get kettlebells back then? Because again,
That's a good question.
yeah.
Very good question. So there was this local supplier, and they're still around. They're, from what I've gathered, they're basically like the OG.
Mm-hmm.
So the guy, the owner, I mean, I still have his number to this day. So he decided to bring kettlebells, and the ones we got, they were kind of like the older Dragon Door ones that
Mm-hmm.
kind of were like trapezoid shaped handles, and they were very rough. So I could recall when I arrived at my cert and then I held the handles of the kettlebells there, I said, wow, these are a lot smoother than the ones I have back home. So I said, okay, I am a lot more confident that I would not have to grip it as hard, or my hands would not get torn,
Mm-hmm.
and just adding a little chalk, and that was like one of the treats that I had. And then I think 2013, 2014, more suppliers came in. So there's a lot more competition. So like the ones I have here at home right now, they feel a lot like the Rogue kettlebells in the US. So those are a lot better. So I'm telling the supplier that I work with, that I get my kettlebells from, and where my students get their kettlebells from, I said, if you could get the E-Coat kettlebells, you will really have a lot of people buying it from you. And I said, trust me on this. So I really hope he finds a way to bring those over here.
Yeah. People forget about, well, number one, like the quality of the equipment that you get makes such a huge difference. And I know that I was fortunate because even though not very many people knew what a kettlebell was, there was a sports store like very close to where I
Sports
live.
Authority or something else?
No, it's something local called Shields. I don't
Mm.
think I think they're in a couple places around the Midwest. It's like a small chain, and this was back in 2008. And I got a 16-kilo kettlebell from them, and it wasn't super great quality, but the handle wasn't too rough. It was just kind of like I always felt like the horns of the handle were too long, so it changes the way that you do certain exercises, but that's not a huge deal. It's not nearly as bad as if it's like sandpaper,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I remember getting my first, I think my first 3 kettlebells were through them, and back then it was like, okay, now you can just go someplace and get, like a 70-pound or 32-kilo kettlebell with no problem. But back then it was like I had to specially order it and waited weeks, and I would call like every day, like, hey, is it in yet? Is it in yet? And then and I paid. I mean, back then it was a lot. It was like $127 for this 32-kilo bell, which is not that bad actually, because when I went to Israel in 2009 to live on a kibbutz for 6 months, I bought a kettlebell. This was even more precarious because I had a car in Omaha, so I could just drive to this place and pick up the bell and drive back. When I was in Omaha, no, I'm sorry, when I was in Israel, I remember being on the kibbutz, which was in northern Israel, and I went with some of my new friends down to Tel Aviv by train, and happened to walk by a sports store in Tel Aviv that had a 24-kilo kettlebell. And I was like, I need to buy that now because I need something I'm going to need to work out here. And it was even rarer to see something like that in Israel because like very few people knew what a kettlebell was. It's much more common now than it was back then.
That was 2009.
2009, yeah. And because I was there for a 6-month stint before I came back to the U.S. But that cost me as much as the 32 did. It was like $127 for a 24, you know. So I only bought one. I was like, I'm not gonna buy a
Yeah.
whole bunch more. But yeah, I think people in the U.S. and maybe Europe. I know in Europe they weren't easy to find either, at least not in the early days. But yeah, it was like a real investment to find one, and it may not have even been a good one. It was just your best bet. So it's good to see that slowly but surely the quality is starting to make its way, to other parts of the world.
Yeah. So like even in India, they're already having. Because I was there last June, I assisted at level 1. They had some decent bells, but then we also had like the vanilla ones, the ones that we usually would not recommend unless that's the only thing available.
Right. And this was India, you said?
Yeah, I was in Chennai
I was gonna ask if it was Chennai. Yeah, with Sean
with
teaching
Sean.
at
Yeah.
Yeah,
So I was
India.
jokingly saying, yeah, it's a fun place, really diverse culture,
Yeah,
but I learned a lot. And their community there is, I would say, very energetic.
nice. Yeah, well, I mean, India is like the cradle of physical culture. People forget
Oh
that,
yeah.
but it's like a lot of the uh, wrestling and martial arts come from
Mhm.
there. Like the semi-mythical progenitor of the martial arts, the Bodhisattva,
Yeah.
was from India, and then I think he went and became a Buddhist monk somewhere in China or Japan or something like that. So people a lot of times think, the martial arts as we know them, or the traditional
Mhm.
ones, come from the Far East, but it was actually from India
India. Yeah.
that it originated, or from somebody who was from India, presumably bringing his knowledge from their martial arts with them. So, yeah, no, I would love to visit India because I think, I mean, ever since I saw the Temple of Doom, I always thought,
Mhm.
India seems like a fun place. Not so much the Temple of Doom, but like
Yeah, but
places outside of it seem like that would be very fun. Now, you've gone and you've traveled, you've been an assistant at a number of these different places. Uh, how has the kettlebell culture within the Philippines developed since you've been teaching for the last 10 years?
okay, what's interesting is, so I got certified in 2012, and that's 10 years ago. So there are a lot of people who are also using kettlebells nowadays. So we have over here we have like a big kettlebell sport group,
Hmm.
and then, well, there have been a few Filipinos who have mustered the strength to actually do the level 1. And I'm actually sending a student again to Taiwan in March to do the level 1. So there are people, but one thing that's challenging for them is, I think, remember how it was so mystical and mythical back in the RKC era? I think for
Yeah,
some of them, that's still the image they get. And then I would often have to remind them that, guys, let me remind you that I'm not exactly a massive human being.
yeah,
So you just have to really do the work, and it's manageable. And you can pass it. I mean, it's not going to be comfortable, of course, but I mean, you won't go home on a stretcher. I always tell them that. And I would tell them that as long as you give yourself at least 9 months of real serious preparation, you're gonna hack it.
yeah. That's the thing people forget is, I mean, some people I have known to be able to jump in with like a few weeks or even a few days notice, maybe not a few days, but a few weeks notice, and they do okay because they're already in like extraordinary physical shape. But even a lot of gym rats don't realize just how much work there's going to be.
Mhm.
So it's a rarity for somebody to just be able to jump in with like 3 to 4 weeks notice and actually do a good job. I think maybe nowadays it's a little bit easier because I mean, I don't know what your cert was like, but I can say for sure, having assisted at a number of certifications,
Mhm.
they're not nearly as tough as they used to be. I mean, I think, and this is not a criticism of StrongFirst's approach at all. I think that what they've done is they've taken it from what it was initially, which was kind of like a little bit of like really like a rite of passage. It's like we want
Pun
to
intended,
see,
yes.
because there's certain things that physically they can test on you, like can you do X number of reps with a certain weight in a certain amount of time, or what have you? Can you do the technique properly? And a lot of people can do that and still show, if they're fresh, show
Yeah.
a certain level of professionalism. But if you were really tired and you've been working out 8 hours a day for the last 3 days, and then
Yeah.
you have to do these things,
And you have
if
to do it on Sunday when you're tired.
yeah, exactly. So I think that was like a big, even when I was going, it wasn't as big of a characteristic of the certs as it had been in the past, because I remember reading, we talked about Sean Cans a second ago, who was the
Yeah.
master instructor in Chennai, but I remember reading a story. It may have been secondhand. I don't think it was even directly from him, but somebody recounting about how when he went through his cert, they were doing so many snatches, and like they had just this crappy form, they because they were students, they were still learning, that like their hands would rip open, and Sean, in order to make sure that he could keep a grip on the bell, he put his hands in the dirt so that he could get a grip, so that he could keep going even with bloody hands, torn up hands, and that was way before my era. It was nothing like that, but I do remember horror stories that we would hear. Not, I'm saying this in kind of like a tongue-in-cheek way. Like one person was saying, we were all like what are they going to make us do? And somebody's like, I heard at the last cert that they had to do a Turkish get up with a weight above their snatch test weight and then walk with it across like a football field or whatever. So
Yeah.
we would hear stories like this, and we didn't have to do anything like that, but still there were stories that like they would do. We did this on the first day. We didn't do it the whole weekend. Yeah, your kettlebell had to go with you everywhere you went. So you had to go to the bathroom. You had to take your kettlebell with you. Never mind, that's a little unsanitary, and you can only hope people are washing their hands. But what were some other ones? I remember we didn't do this at mine, but I heard about this at other ones. Every time a
Like how many
plane,
swings a day?
what's that?
Like how many swings did you rack up by day one?
Oh God, I mean, I lost count honestly, but well, I'll tell you this. I don't think it was as much as some of the earlier certs, because I remember hearing stories. People would be like, every time a plane flew overhead, the instructors would be like, okay, let's stop what we're doing. Everybody do 20 swings, or 100 swings, like whatever it may have been. And I'll tell you this. I mean, I was working out like an hour and a half a day for like 8 months. I mean, or at least I would say by the last 5 months, it ended up being close to an hour and a half a day. Couldn't get away with that now because I just, not only do I not have the time, I don't have the patience, but I still would wake up every morning just completely sore. So despite the fact that I was already doing like probably a superhuman volume, it just wasn't enough to prepare me. I mean, it was enough to prepare me to succeed in the weekend, but not to not get sore. Like I didn't wake up feeling fresh as a daisy. That much is for sure. So I don't know, but I would say it's reasonable to say that the number of swings we did on the first day was probably in the 1,000+ range. I mean, easy. It's hard to say exactly, but I know for a fact it was like we didn't just do 100 and call it good. I mean, we had several workouts that might have been over 100 swings. Likewise with snatches and stuff like that. So yeah, it was tough, man. And again, I think now they don't do that as much. There's still a boatload of work, but it's less of a rite of passage and more of like, really focusing on making them good instructors.
Yeah. So I remember my level one. I was prepping, and I think if I recall, I have to dig up my notes. I think I was doing like 100 swings daily with a 40 kilo because I was able to work up to that strength.
Yeah.
And then the first half of the day, before lunch break, I was already cramping up real bad. So I was still thinking, man, I just have to make sure I survive up to day 3. And
Yeah.
I was really sore, but I was just so glad that after the third day I passed.
Yes. Yeah. I got to tell you, I had like, I remember in my cert, one of the assistant instructors on my team, so not the team leader, he was one of the assistants. He was like, I would honestly say, and I would tell him this to his face, so this is not, some behind his back sort of a thing, that he was way too strict about technique. Meaning, like, and on the one hand, it's like you want the candidates to be very strict about their technique, but you also have to understand you're there to teach them, and that some of the things that you're going to teach them, even though they might get them that extra 1 or 2% in their performance, they're not necessarily going to be the things that they're not necessarily the things that are going to be required for them to pass. Like there are certain things that they want to see in the technique, and then you expect their technique is going to improve and look better as time goes on. But as long as they're doing things like this, their performance and safety is going to be fine. So it was, I think, just before the grad workout, he came up to me. I'm not going to mention his name, but Dan John was there. Dan John was teaching. He wasn't my team leader, but he was one of the team leaders. And Dan was walking by as this assistant came up to me. And he's like, "Hey, I want to take a look at your kettlebell snatch real quick." He's like, didn't happen to have a kettlebell, but he's like, "Show me like what a swing would look like." And so I just mimicked it. And he's like, "Dan, take a look at this." And so Dan was looking, and then he's like, "Now show me what the snatch would look like." So I mimicked that. And he's like, "You see that?" And Dan goes, "No." And so he's like, your hips are not snapping as much in your snatch versus your swing. And all of a sudden, like panic mode gets turned on. And I was like, what does that mean? And this was after the technique test. I should mention that after technique test, before the grad workout. He's like, "It'll be reflected." I said, did that mean I fail? He goes, "It'll be reflected in your notes." So rather than saying no, but just, letting you know that this is something that's going to make it better, I was like panicking for the next 2 hours because like I was like, was all this for nothing, you know? Like and at the end, our team this didn't help either. Our team was the last to leave. Everybody else had gone through, you know, the team leaders had gone through all the sheets and told them,
Evaluations and whatnot. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And for whatever reasons, ours took like forever. So Pavel had already left, everybody else had already left, and so my team leader called me up, and I was preparing for the worst, and he said, "Well, congratulations, Alex, you passed." And I was like, "Oh my God, that's amazing!" But then on the inside, I was also like, you know, f this guy because, you know, like like the last 2 hours, you know, were not exactly blissful as a result of his criticism. So yeah, one of the things too that I think is important when it comes to if you want to become a candidate. So for those who are listening or are interested in becoming a kettlebell instructor candidate, you're only going to be tested by you're only going to be tested on the things that are on the evaluation. So if you have like that checklist, which they show you, they don't keep it from you, you don't have to worry. Like I remember assisting at one in Israel in, it was I guess 2017. It was the last one I assisted at, and we had rented out. It was like me and a bunch of the instructor candidates were staying in a rented house in Caesarea or Caesarea,
Mm-hmm.
as it's called in Hebrew. And they were like, "Oh, my hand is a little bit this way when I do the get up. Like, are they going to fail me?" And I had to tell them probably like 10 times. I'm like, if it's not on the sheet, you're not going to get tested on it. So you're okay. Make sure you've got these things on the sheet though, because if you don't, if you've got, you know, even one of those, like these are like must have things. So don't worry about, you know, which angle your hand is at, you know, in the Turkish getup or what have you.
Yeah.
But it's funny to see how the cert has progressed over time. But uh, most people who have not been involved for 10 years, like we have, just don't even couldn't
Yeah.
even fathom some of the stories.
Yeah, and I remember like even back in Chennai, there was one candidate instructor who was asking the same thing, and Sean just said that look at the sheet, the boxes there just have to be checked. Everything else, don't worry about it too much. And whenever I'd also be teaching my students, I say, look, the first thing we have to do is make sure that you're safe, okay? And then everything else you can worry about later on.
Yeah.
And I said and then there are times that even some of my other students and some like a friend of mine who did the level one, but he decided to let his cert lapse, and I said, look at this. So I was able to show him my form like years ago, and he said, will you pass that? And he says yes. Now I said, now look compare it to what I do now. It's different, isn't it? And then, like you see the improvement, yeah. But then it was still enough to pass. So I said, that's all you have to worry about is it has to be safe and it hits just enough for the standard. Then you can worry about getting better. Because if you're already trying to just be the best, then what's the point of improving? Because there's
Yeah.
nothing left to improve.
Yeah. I think one of the other things too, this happened to me after my cert, was that like my swing got really, really crappy, and it's because I was overthinking it. And
Mm-hmm.
you know, this happens a lot with, I think, if people who have a certain skill that they want to get good at. Maybe it doesn't happen to everybody. I'm sure it doesn't happen to everybody, but it happened to me. I was like, okay, you know, the swing is like the center of the kettlebell universe. So now I got to like analyze every little possible thing. And I think that it is a tendency, even among people that I know who are not instructors. Like I did a form check for a gal just a couple days ago. She'd sent a video, and then I sent the video back, you know, and she sent me a bunch of different things. But one of the things I pointed out was in the ballistics that her knees were coming forward as she extended. So it's not a problem, obviously, that the knees bend, but it was
Yeah.
like the knees would go from here to here as she stood up. So it's like kind of over reliance on the quads. And I pointed it out. And one of the things she said is like, there's so many things to think about with the swing, or, you know, with all these movements. And I wrote back, I said, they're definitely, it's definitely not something that you can do mindless. I'm paraphrasing, but all I want you to do is focus on just one thing at a time and not worry about trying to fix all these different things at once. Because knowing that I went through that phase, even as somebody who had already passed and, you know, had become a full-fledged instructor, it's very easy to overanalyze things. And at a certain point, you realize that you can't deepen your skill without just doing a lot of repetitions uh, in a certain way, meaning like a lot of the clues that you're going to learn along the way to improving at anything are going to be hidden in the practice itself. So you
Yes.
can't keep thinking, you know what, I got to do this to improve my technique. I got to do that. It's like, you don't have to do any of those things because it's not going to help you. Like, you don't have enough experience for it to help you. So what you need to keep doing is just you find one thing that you need to fix, focus on that only, don't worry about the other stuff. And then once that becomes kind of like comfortable and, and almost second nature, like you don't have to think about it as much, then you can add something different.
Yeah. So quoting our director of education at StrongFirst, Brett Jones, nothing that 10,000 reps won't do. And
Yeah.
we actually have this thing in psychology and learning that's called parallel processing. So, like, good example right now is you're doing that, you're chatting with me, you're drinking your coffee, and later you'll probably be scratching an itchy part in your body. So we're doing multiple things all at once. But a lot of these things we could do because they're already ingrained in our body and mind, and they're second nature. So you want to look for that one thing that you want to work on, as you were saying,
Hmm.
and then get to a point where you could really do it and do it competently, and then do it competently without having to think about it. Then you can add the next thing and then the next thing. That's actually one of the best ways to learn how to stack technique.
Absolutely. And that works. I can say for sure that works with other skills as well, like learning an instrument or learning a foreign language. Um, you know, people, everything is everything else. So when it comes to like something that if it's a skill, the general processes are going to be the same and the details are going to change. And a lot of people have the opposite problem because they don't see strength training as a skill, or they don't see exercise in general as a skill. They see it as like an activity. And sometimes this is reflected. You can see this reflected in people's training because I'm in a couple Facebook groups. There's one that's a calisthenics group, for instance, and it's a mixture of people who are like beginners to very advanced and everything in between. And sometimes people will post stuff, and they're just average folks who just kind of have a passion for training. And I'll see some of their exercise selection, and I'm like, okay, I can see that their mindset about it is that they want to do something that's challenging, but the stuff that they're choosing is not skill based. So, which doesn't make them bad people. It doesn't mean that they can't get good results. But what it does mean is that as long as their goal is not to be like, oh, I want to do a planche or I want to do a muscle up,
Yeah.
then they'll be fine. They'll keep getting the results thereafter. But some people have like sort of an incongruence with that. So people, I think this is very common in the world of people who discover a type of training that they like, and then they want to start working up to the really cool stuff, but they're not doing the individual thing. Like, okay, here's what's something that I can really focus in on right now, and then turn that into something I could do subconsciously. And then what's the next thing and the next thing? So like many years ago, my coach, Scott Stevens, got a call from one of the local boot camps, and they were like, we want to learn kettlebells because we use them with our people. We especially want to learn a clean and jerk and the snatch. And he's like,
Are they
all right,
crazy?
well, yeah. He's like, okay, well, I'm not gonna teach them those things. He's like, I'm gonna teach them what they need because he knew better. And so by doing that, he was able to change their minds and show them there's a lot more to it. And, your students are going to get plenty out of it. A lot of people just,
And yeah,
yeah,
if you're gonna try to learn the snatch and the clean and jerk right away, I mean, you have to start out with the basic hinge, then the kettlebell deadlift. I mean, you can get a lot out of those first. As a friend of mine would say, why not get the low hanging fruit first
yeah,
before you try to go to the top branch? So eventually, when you develop all the other skills and then you learn the snatch, or then you learn the clean and jerk, you have developed all the prerequisites. It's much easier to pick it up, and you will get a lot more of the benefits rather than trying to jump into those things prematurely and you're not ready for it.
yeah, yeah. You know what? One of the things, and this just occurred to me as you were saying that, I think one of the things too is that a lot of people see a lot of these various movements as almost being kind of like tricks, meaning,
Mhm.
like I remember when I was younger and I read about Bruce Lee doing one arm pull-ups. I was like, I remember I had this vision in my head, like, how cool would that be if I went to my university's gym and I just started doing one arm pull-ups? I'm like, I'm going to start working toward that. And it's like, how little did I know, like how much stuff you have to be able to do before you even think about doing one arm pull-ups. And I think it's the very same with a lot of people. They see these sorts of things and they think, oh, it's just, Pavel talks about this in, I think it's Enter the Kettlebell, like, oh, he's not strong. He just has good technique, like even people who are relatively uh, who know their way around a weight room might say stuff like that, and so all the more so with people who are laymen or just enthusiasts or whatever. Yeah, I was reading a very old article recently by Paul Anderson, who was one of the strongest men in history.
Legend.
Oh yeah, yeah, and he said he lamented that a lot of the single arm like pressing work and stuff like that had kind of fallen out of favor as Olympic lifting became more popular, because
Mhm.
he said back in the old days, some of the old timers would do like a one arm jerk or one arm snatch and stuff like that. And he said sometimes these wouldn't these wouldn't impress the crowd as much because they viewed them as being like, okay, well, they're doing it very quickly, so there must be some kind of a trick to it.
Yeah.
They could see, and his point was they could see if they did like a heavy one arm military press. Okay, well, that's something that you can't, that can't be made into a trick or whatever. Now, obviously, we know that if you're like Charles Rigoulot, the guy who I think he still holds the record for the heaviest one arm snatch, who's I think at 180 something pounds, he snatched like 260 pounds with
Oh,
one
it's
arm.
pretty good. It's pretty impressive.
Yeah. Even more so because he was not American as I would like to,
Mhm.
brag if he were, like Paul Anderson. He was a French guy. And this was pre-World War II. So this wasn't like some time of like massive abundance like it is nowadays, where the guy was, had an easy living, sedentary life and, could just train at his leisure. He probably had a very physical job.
Yeah, that's how it
Didn't
was
have,
back then.
yeah, didn't have high quality food. Probably sanitation was abominable. So long story short, yeah, there's a lot of stuff that I think people think are just kind of cool physical tricks that they'll be able to work up to. And I think in the back of their mind, it's more like this would be fun to do or impress other people. They don't think about the fact that it's all based on skills that they have to have built before they can even think about trying it. It
Yeah,
doesn't
let me
occur to
share
them.
with you. Yeah, let me share with you another story. I'm not sure if you're familiar with pool.
Pool, I'm not good at it, but I'm
Yeah,
familiar
yeah,
with
but
it.
you're familiar. Okay, so
Oh,
that's
sure.
enough. So, um, arguably, probably the greatest pool player of all time, Efren Reyes, is a Filipino, right? Now, legend has it that when he's back in his hometown, he would go to the poorer pool halls and watch like these teenagers or these guys who basically they've had too much to drink and they're just playing, and he would watch them make all these unorthodox shots. Like they would just hit the ball as hard as they can and then see how many balls could get in, and then he would spend hours watching all of these techniques uh, that were very raw, very barbaric to a degree, and then he would reverse engineer them so that he could do them on command. And anyone who's looked at any pool highlight reel, I mean, you would always see Afran Reyes. So that's how he got good. Is he would see because he knew that it worked, so he just had to figure out how to make it work. And I
Yeah.
think even in skill, that's the same thing. You just have to figure out how your structure can do something, and then reverse engineer to make it work for you. Because I have often told other students as well, is you can't copy let's say this person's technique because you're not built like him. So but then you can learn a few things from him, and then adjust it to make it fit you.
Yeah, exactly. I think a good way to look at it is you don't necessarily want to do what they're doing, but you want to know how they're doing it, because that
That's right.
is what's going to help you figure out the what. So like, in when it comes to your strength training, the what, or like the exact details, sets and reps, amount of weight and stuff like that. There's obviously a peril in trying to copy the best, or even just people who were like your friends, if you're brand new and you're like, because this is what I did at the beginning, like I had a friend who took up various different bodybuilding moves, and he got some great
Mhm.
results, so he showed me what to do, and he never told me. I mean, obviously he's like, here are the sets and reps. He didn't tell me the weight, so I was able to figure that out on my own,
Mhm.
so that's acceptable. There was enough of a gap where I could include the how, and included just enough of the what, meaning the sets and reps, that I could get some success. But yeah, that's a big issue that a lot of people have, and even with technique, that's the case. I remember I learned this, probably one of the more enlightening ones that I learned this about, because I knew it about the squat, military press, the swing to a certain degree, but I remember I discovered for me many years ago that the snatch was a lot easier if the bell passed in between my eyes, on the way up, or at least that was the intention. Because what a lot of people do, and it doesn't matter as much for swings, I don't think, is they're too far off to the side. So I found it worked great. And so I was like, I'm just going to apply this to everybody. And then it wasn't until one of our colleagues in Scotland, I mentioned it, or maybe in a comment or something on a Facebook post, and he said that'll probably work with, you know, people who have maybe normal sized arms or longer arms, but if you're like me and you have really short arms, it actually doesn't work. You have to do it more off to the side. And so that reminded me that, okay, you know, even the stuff that seems like it might be like a universal may not be the case. And so that's one of the things now that when I'm teaching people to snatch, I'll be like, put your arms by your side so I can see how long they are. And if they can just barely reach into their pockets, I know I can skip over, you know, the snatch down the middle, because it's not going to matter, you know. Our friend Piers Kwan would be a good example,
Yeah.
because I always say he's like a normal sized dwarf, you know, like he's taller than I am actually, but his structure,
His arms are short. He has a long torso, and
and
he has
very short
small
legs.
hands.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and
So,
short
I
legs.
mean, Pierce, I hope when you're listening to it, I'm sorry, but yeah, Alex and I did not mention this, but people, I'm sure so many people have already noticed that you are like Peter Dinklage's long lost twin.
Yes, his long lost Australian twin, exactly. No, but really, he does. That's just like what his structure is like. And so for him, you know, if he didn't know anything about kettlebells and I had to teach him how to snatch a kettlebell, I would never tell him to snatch it down the middle, because it wouldn't make any sense, you know,
Yeah,
for him. But for
but
somebody
yeah,
else, yeah.
it
But
would.
another great
And
example. Yeah, go ahead.
like another good example is, you probably like first when it comes to pressing, because this was something that was taken apart during during the last Kettlebell Strong workshop in Singapore. So Jeff Newport decided to call me to the center stage, and then he asked me to raise my arm. So just to give you an example, you could see that my elbow is way past my head, and
Mhm.
I am about 5'5",
Yeah.
and yet my wingspan is as long as Jeff's.
Mm.
And then so he said that for me pressing would be a challenge. So he said that there are certain ways that I have to adjust in order to press a certain given amount of weight. And you see, circling back to Pierce, since he has short arms and he has a pretty massive upper body, it wouldn't be that
Yeah.
hard for him.
Yeah, actually, Piers is a great presser. I remember he and I were working out in Peter Jankowski's home gym
Hmm.
in Newcastle, Australia,
Yeah. Hmm.
and we were working on. I mean, his press was super easy, and
Yeah.
mine, again, I've got like an albatross wingspan. Like my
Mhm.
elbow is like above my hairline, and I've got my
Yeah.
shoulders pulled down. But I'm very good at pull-ups, and so Piers was asking me for some pull-up
Yeah.
advice, and he's good at pull-ups for sure. It's just
Yeah.
it
He is.
doesn't come
Yes.
as
Yeah.
it doesn't come as naturally to him as pressing does. But it's interesting to see that, because I think most people look from the outside and they think, all right, well, this person's good presser. Maybe if they're not good at pull-ups now, all they're gonna have to do is put in some work and they'll be just fine. But there's like a different like learning curve based off of leverages that you
Yeah.
ultimately you're gonna have to consider. I don't think it's an indicator of how strong you can get by any stretch of the imagination. Well, maybe to a certain degree, but not for a very long time. Because I've known, for instance, one of my friends who's a former world champion powerlifter in the 130, I think it was 132-pound weight class.
Yeah. 132-pound weight class. That's right.
Yeah, his bench is like, now I think, and he doesn't weigh 132 anymore. I think he's closer to 150, but it's like over 350-pound bench, and he's got arms like mine. He's got very long arms.
So that's pretty impressive considering you have like gorilla long arms and to have a very respectable bench. That means he knows what he's doing.
Well, more than that, I mean, his squat and deadlift are equally impressive. I mean, at least back when he was competing, I think his bench when he was competing was like 305, or maybe 315, I don't remember. His squat and his deadlift were both 505 pounds. Like,
Wow. So yeah, for squats you want to have like a wider hips,
yeah,
shorter femurs, and a short torso.
yeah. And his deadlift, because because of his long arms, was like probably his best lift. I think he would agree. But yeah, I mean, he could easily deadlift, over 500 pounds. I remember working out with him a couple times, and he was just deadlifting 405 for reps, like no problem at all.
Yeah. I'm sure you've
405
probably
would be
deadlifted 405 too, right?
what's that?
I mean, I'm sure you've probably pulled 405 now, given the amount of mass you've put on since the earlier days.
No, actually, I mean, I can deadlift double body weight, but it's not quite in the 400s. The thing is with barbell stuff, I usually I'll get to a certain level. I'm like, okay, I'm bored, and I just move on to something, or it hasn't been a priority. Like I think the other thing too, and I could be wrong. I mean, I think, but I do think part of it was because I was working on it recently, and I stopped just because my low back didn't feel great. And I'm not blaming the deadlift. I'm just saying that I was doing it a lot, and I just wasn't doing other stuff that probably would have kept it feeling happy. It wasn't like shooting pain or anything. It was just like it just didn't feel great. So
Yeah,
ultimately, I just got
I know what you mean.
yeah, I just got sick of it, and I was like, I don't want to keep pushing. And the other thing that I noticed, and this is just a complete side note, and this is again going into why it's so important to have understand you as yourself as an individual. In the past, I found one of the things that really helped me out the most with my deadlift, which sort of surprised me, but looking back now doesn't really surprise me, was doing good mornings and just general lower back work seemed to be a big help. And I think it's a big help for a lot of people because their low back, if your low back lags behind and it's a weak link, at best your body's going to say, nope, we're not going any further. At worst, you could get very hurt. But what happened with me is because I have a tendency to have um, posterior or no, an anterior pelvic tilt. So I've got kind of the, like the excessive lordosis of the low back. If I'm not careful, it affects my breathing so that it's harder to breathe with my diaphragm because now it's like there's, just more space between my diaphragm and pelvic floor. So I find it more difficult to breathe. And then that affects my sleep, which affects my recovery. So no matter what, again, I could,
Snowballs.
yeah, exactly. And so I could, whenever I would include stuff that would keep those things under control, it wasn't a big deal. It's just a matter of adding more and more things to your training. And if I'm very busy, I'm like, okay, I got to do just the deadlift would be the main thing, so I got to go in.
What are the main essentials?
Yeah, exactly. Well, and the other thing too is my recent deadlifting focus. Meaning as of several months ago, I was like, I want to just see how long I can get away with just doing high rep deadlifts and continue to make improvements on my 5 rep max. But I wasn't doing any squatting. And so I realistically, if I were to go back and do it again, I would have squatted heavy and then ended up with a like higher rep deadlift stuff. And that probably would have made it even more successful because, it was an interesting experiment, but it kind of petered out after a while. And I think, when that happens, you've got to figure, okay, well, what do I got to do differently? And looking back, that's what I would have done. I would have done like, because I was going in, I think twice a week for leg day stuff. So looking back, I probably would have done, let's say one day, heavy-ish with the back squat, and one day, maybe moderate to light, and taking it from there. But long story short, you have to figure out what your body needs. A lot of people, again, they think that the body's sort of an algorithm and they can just put in, some sort of a code, and next thing you know, it's gonna spit out results, and it's definitely not the story.
So in my case, like what happened is I actually benefited a lot by doing that more anterior chain work, like more dead bugs and working on my quads to help reinforce those to help with the heavy squats and the heavy deadlifts. So plug in for your program done of dead bug. Right there. And another wise piece of advice I got from one of our friends at Original Strength, Rick Garcia. He said that at a certain point, if your body is not built to handle heavy loads, and he said that in his case, anything over double body weight, he would start using a belt. And back then, of course, I shrugged it off because I wanted to see how much I could pull off totally raw. But now, I mean, since I'm no spring chicken anymore, when it's a little over double body weight and I'm gonna go up in the volume, I would put on a belt just to play it safe. I would say I'd rather quote unquote hang my head in shame, but then live to lift another day. Then go totally raw, beltless and whatnot, and then end up being sore for a few days, and I missed those training sessions, which could have helped me move forward. more. So that's another thing, as I often tell people, is that you'll always think about the next session. So there are times that you, of course, if you have to test, you have to test, but you have to often restrain yourself from YOLOing in the gym.
Yeah, I think if you're not getting paid to do it, you need to ask yourself if it's really such a good idea. Like I understand the whole ego thing, but I'm with you. Like I would much rather be like, all right, in the grand scheme of things, this is not going to ruin anything if I don't, you know, if I don't max out or if I don't hit all the reps I was supposed to. If something doesn't feel right, it's like you gotta listen to that. And this, by the way, is I think, and this is a conversation for another day, but I think this is a good case as well for some intelligent variety. And I think that if
Oh
you're
yeah.
if you're in the intermediate section of train, like if you're a beginner, you don't need that much variety. Um, I think when you're an intermediate,
You need
you
some variety.
will, yeah, or you'll prosper probably a lot more from having more of it because your body needs to be generally strong before it can be specifically strong. And then when you
Yes.
start getting to more advanced levels,
Then you
then
have to
you
go
need
back,
a
circle
lot
back.
less. Yeah, then you need less variety. Like when I was getting ready for my level 2 recertification last year, I was doing a program that Paul McElroy had written for me for my military press because I had, I had still had 4 more kilos I needed to add to it. So I needed to go from 36 to 40 kilos or about 80 pounds to 88 pounds, which doesn't seem like a
Yeah,
lot, but if it's on one arm and it's over your
it
head,
is.
it's a lot. So, and I managed to get it, no problem, but there was really no variety to the pressing apart from the total number of reps I might do in a set. So
Mhm.
variety was much more limited. Well, the technique, there was no variety whatsoever. The goal was make the technique exactly the same every single time and make it as close to what you're going to be tested on,
Yeah,
and
correct.
because it was half body weight, that would be, I would say, at least, approaching advanced. It's certainly not world class by any stretch of the imagination, but um, beyond that, then I think you can also start getting into specialized variety where it's like, the stuff in Kenneth J's book, Perfecting the Press. Most people don't need that.
Mhm. Yeah,
But
I
yeah, at
mean,
any rate,
for me, it was just I did more when I had to research my level 2 press. It was the last time I did it, I just got off the SFL, so that was lucky enough that the carryover from all the barbell military pressing and all the benching helped me keep my level 2 press.
yeah.
So that's another. But then, of course, I often say that you still have to practice the skill. So I still had to practice my single bell work.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, for a while, you don't need to necessarily be super specific in your training to maintain a lot of your skills. But then once you want to bring those skills up, it's, you know, you gotta
Yeah.
deal with the fact that you need to be specific.
Or if you put them in the closet for so long, you need to dust them off so they become shiny again.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, I know it's getting late where you are, so we should probably wrap things up so that you don't end up like a shuffling zombie tomorrow, completely
Yeah, no, I'm
incapable.
fine.
Yes, but
Well, this was
this has
fun.
been a what's that?
This was fun.
Yes, it was a lot of fun. I think we covered some really great ground. Where can people follow you online if they want to follow your training and they want to get more tips and tactics from you?
So I'm on Facebook and I'm on Instagram. People can just look up my name. I'll be there. I'm also on Twitter. And yes, I'm also on TikTok. So basically all the major social media platforms. That's the easiest way to get a hold of me.
Excellent. And then for Instagram, like what's your Instagram handle? I think people can go to
Uh,
Facebook and they put in Mark Limbaga, they'll find you pretty easily. But what about
it's
Instagram?
in Instagram. It's ML Girovic Strong. Same for
ML.
Twitter and TikTok. So it's
Great. M. Mhm.
like Mama L Lima Girovic. It's Girevik and then Strong.
Excellent. I will put that in the show notes so that people who want to follow you can do that easily. Just copy, paste, whatever you got to do. And there you have it. There you be. So thank you very much for coming on the show.
And it was a pleasure.
Absolutely, absolutely. And to all the listeners, I say go follow him, follow his tips and advice. I think again, you don't see too many people who have been in the kettlebell world training people for 10 years like Mark has been. So do yourself a favor and get some advice from the old school, from the RKC era and onward, Pavel style of training. I think you will enjoy it greatly. So thank you all for listening. And as always, have fun and happy training.